Welcome to another episode of Experiential Realism. I'd like to talk more about our deceased loved ones appearing not just in ordinary dreams but also lucid dreams, dreams in which you know you are dreaming while they happen. I would also like to remind the audience that I've had some experiences that are strongly indicative or suggestive of continued awareness after physical death. By no means conclusive on their own, of course. One was apparently being contacted by my deceased stepfather in a lucid dream, as he promised when he was alive. I was aware I was dreaming and exploring my own dream world when this was suddenly interrupted by him and a strange accompanying guide. In that experience, me and my stepdad embraced, and I was overcome with overwhelming emotions and love before he proceeded to tell me that it's all true, that the afterlife is real. At the time, as I said before, I was a staunch materialist and attempted to dismiss it as a sleep hallucination, but now, as an idealist, I considered that perhaps he was really making contact with me from beyond the grave and fulfilling his promise of confirming to me that death is only an illusion. The other experience, which is also suggestive of mind beyond the physical body, was when I collapsed at university years ago, possibly as the result of something like vasovagal syncope, as I hadn't eaten anything and had been binging the previous night like a typical student. I saw no bright light and no spirit guides, but I did find myself in a state of bliss and resting on a fluffy cloud surrounded by a white mist. It sounds funny, I know. I became curious about what was happening and subsequently found myself hovering above the heads of people in the pub on campus. I had no thought of self apart from being a point of awareness gradually moving through space. I could also feel how much the students enjoyed the company they kept and how much they tried to impress one another. This is really the best I can do to describe how I felt, before I regained awareness of my body in front of the urinal with my head on this guy's lap who kept slapping me in a frantic attempt to revive me. I felt uncomfortable and annoyed that he had snapped me out of a blissful and carefree state. But he did look after me and took me back to the pub where my friends got me a glass of water as the students who found me told them that I had looked morbidly pale and dead. As I sipped my water, I looked around the pub to see the same people in my bird's eye view experience, and without telling anyone, I thought, did I have a hallucination based on my subconscious registering the faces of everyone present in the pub as I made my way to the loo? Or had I really been floating above the heads of these people? I didn't dare open my mouth at the time because of how crazy it sounded, and materialism was already rife in academia. I don't really say I had an NDE because, save for how morbidly pale I apparently looked to the bloke who found me, I never required any medical assistance and was never examined, let alone resuscitated by any doctor. And the hospital happens to be next to the campus. So I don't know what happened other than to say that the ostensible OBE, out-of-body experience, impressed upon me. There was no thought of Olindo, but of course it was still me as an awareness, and I certainly remembered that I had collapsed in front of the urinal when I was resting on that fluffy cloud and feeling blissful. I can see how easy it is for anyone to make fun of this experience, but it was something that in terms of awareness, in terms of experience, it was real. It just happened, whether people like it or not. And it had some kind of impact. And I still think about it today. I wouldn't say I was briefly in some Christian heaven or some religious shit like that. But it certainly felt weird and mystical, and despite my brief peace, I never acquired any universal knowledge. It was what it was. I was still an individuated awareness, able to fly like a mouse trailing cursor in the air and free of corporeal discomfort. I was still me, but despite not having a body, I was perhaps more expanded too, because I seemed to feel what others felt, and locating the source of those feelings in my visual field, which included vibrant colours and a well-defined pub environment. So if I really acquired a perspective outside and away from my collapsed body, I must say that the world looked pretty much as one would expect it to look. It certainly wasn't some abstract fields of equations, if one can visualize such a thing, which is what most physicists claim the world is really like. It was a colourful, mundane environment that seemed to favour direct realism more than anything else. Perhaps this experience provides a glimpse of what awaits us all beyond this mortal coil, and may help us to refine our metaphysical view of reality, refine idealist metaphysics. Or perhaps it doesn't. Who can be sure, right? I'm actually considering setting up a Psychomanteum and attempting communication with the other side. A Psychomanteum is an experiment devised by Raymond Moody, the man who coined the term near-death experience. And it's based on the methods of the ancient Greek oracles of death. They used to go to underground chambers to ward off noise, which is redolent of the program Stranger Things, which depicts the Stargate project and experiments with remote viewing. I don't have access to underground bunkers, but it might just be possible with the right tools and conditions to turn one of the rooms in my house into a Psychomanteum. But we'll see, because I will need absolute silence, candles, and a mirror tilted to reflect a wall. The mirror can't show our reflection for some reason. And people can read about this experiment online. And if you go to one of Raymond Moody's websites, I'm sure you'll find it. So, according to observations made by Moody's team, there is also a risk and uncertainty about creating a portal, as you never know what will come through. It's not always the deceased person you wish to contact or wish to see. So you have to be really careful, because strange things have happened when people experimented with this, and Raymond Moody reports an instance when lights began to flicker and everyone felt like a malicious presence was around. More than one person experienced this, so I think it's, like with any experiment, you are really testing and exploring the unknown, really. I would have poo-pooed the Psychomanteum years ago as a materialist, I would have definitely dismissed it, which isn't the right approach because it's not really the way of a true skeptic. You know, if you really want to explore these things and find things out for yourself, you should give this a try. And now, as an idealist, I can actually see this working. You know, because I've dabbled in different types of meditation, I practice lucid dreaming, and it seems feasible that one might be able to communicate with the dead, um, because I really do believe, according to idealism, which is far more tenable than materialism, that people don't really die, that consciousness is indestructible, irreducible. Everyone is the eternal witness. So it's now I find it quite possible. Um, but obviously, many people in the scientific community would outright dismiss it. Uh, they just don't think it's possible because they already adhere to the doctrine of materialism. Um, we are constantly presented with a world of qualitative symbols, and we disagree amongst ourselves on what they represent or what they mean for our comprehension of the world. The brain begins to show electric activity at week 8 in the womb, and yet we still have an ongoing clash between pro-lifers and pro-choicers. 81% of abortions are performed by week 9, and this certainly divides people. Some say a sentient human being is murdered every time an embryo or a fetus is aborted. Others argue that a fetus shouldn't trump the right of the mother to want to live if remaining pregnant and giving birth is too dangerous and life-threatening. I personally think, I'm open to changing my mind, but I personally think that abortion should not be banned, but I also think that it shouldn't be used as a contraceptive either. I think people should avoid abortions, or if they must have one, it should be carried out as early as possible. It's a grey area, and I digress. Um, but it's an example of a point of contention predicated on uncertainty about the nature of reality. There was a good point made by the biologist Mike Levin recently. When one takes the reductionist approach in the search for explanations, one inevitably leaves the physical domain and hits upon a Platonic domain, or a domain of mathematical truths which are unalterable for all time because they are grounded in relational sense. And the physical world can't help but follow these more fundamental rules that provide the free lunches, as he put it, exploited by Darwinian evolution. I was rapt with wonder when Dennis Noble used the analogy of a fist in the middle of Scotland to capture the size of a cellular nucleus and how far it is from the membrane, and also cells containing a network of tunnels that can go from one end of the cell to the other. I highly recommend the debate between him and Richard Dawkins, where they discuss biology, evolution, and there is even a brief mention of quantum mechanics. Apart from being elucidating, the exchange is also entertaining, especially when Noble claims that Lamarck is back after going into how organisms choose which genes survive and can alter DNA, which in turn influences future generations of new cells. And it's hilarious when, after Dawkins observes that Noble's account is very much Darwinian, Noble replies, "Yes, of course, Richard, and I'm a very good Darwinist, and Charles Darwin was very much Lamarckian." I like the fact that Noble is urging a more holistic, top-down approach as opposed to a reductionist bottom-up approach when it comes to healthcare, given that genes, by their associations with other genes, are multifunctional and alterations can be unpredictable. There is still so much that we don't know, but Noble rightfully places emphasis on the environment and the organism as a whole without denying genetic influence. It's a logical addition that also takes into account epigenetics, whereby an increase in DNA typos, as it were, can be allowed in order to latch onto viruses and bacteria and strengthen the immune system in the process. Too much genetic correction can make us organically rigid, so to speak, against external forces to our detriment. There is organic selection going on, apart from the natural selection that occurs as genes are environmentally tested. If changes occur at the cellular nucleus level, and they can propagate through reproduction and be transmitted to future generations, then a form of Lamarckism that warrants safeguarding against the errors of neo-Darwinism is true. Sometimes the reductionist approach can lead scientists to make backward assumptions. They can make the mistake of attempting to explain the source, or what is more fundamental, through secondary elements or classical manifestations, such as materiality. I think it would be wise for scientists and philosophers alike to remember from time to time that as humans we are limited, and our theories and postulations have a proclivity to be wrong or incomplete. In Mike Levin's case, it may be that the best his brilliant mind could come up with to envisage a Platonic realm was oscillation. He's spoken about this before. Of course, we may be talking about a transcendent realm where even oscillation or any type of rule-based activity of this world doesn't apply, because it still implies linear temporality. How is a mere human able to conceptualize a primordial plane of existence where the law of non-contradiction may not apply and paradoxical equivocations may apply? It's a befuddling state of affairs, really. In trying to describe a Platonic realm of perfect forms beyond space-time, Mike Levin inadvertently uses language that invokes meta-time for superpositions in order to circumvent the notion of a static primordial reality, and instead affirm one that oscillates all expressions into existence and manifests all possibilities, of which this entropic universe with its Darwinian evolution is only a spatio-temporal version of appearances. His use of the word oscillate sounds particularly interesting to me in his Platonic panpsychism, which is how I understand his metaphysical worldview thus far. Although I think he's got no qualms with describing himself as an idealist, because my friend of the Cheltenham UK Philosophers podcast managed to get him to admit that his view is idealistic, really, is an idealist, is a proponent of metaphysical idealism. So kudos to my friend Matt Gray for that. And the thing is, I've got no problem with the word panpsychism, because in a way idealism is a form of panpsychism, just not the physicalist type. Mike Levin emphasizes oscillation in a realm where all paradoxes are reconciled to stress the fact that its contents or forms are not necessarily static just because they lie outside temporality. Um, Perhaps he is pointing to the same ineffability many NDEers encounter and describe as the absence of time, and that, according to them, everything seemed to happen all at once, implying that being on the verge of death may get you closer to the source and the full picture, as it were, transcending time, you know. And transcending time then wouldn't necessarily mean static, as it would be another form of constriction, contradicting a realm that is supposed to have more degrees of freedom. At that level, in order to create a cosmos, nature cannot afford to be completely inert if we follow the logic of temporality and causality, unless, of course, the reals of existence are already manifest eternally and time is experienced as an illusion only when consciousness plays the role of a finite being, which would also make sense. That would be analogous to picking a reel and watching a movie. The oscillatory component that a human employs guarantees a kind of freedom where all possibilities are explored, and it begins to look more like quantum superpositions and no causality. You know, it would be infinitely less restricted than our collapsed world. We have forgotten the divine and have thus fallen. Who can understand the infinite? And doesn't the finite complete the infinite? The infinite can't possibly be complete if there isn't an experience of the finite. You know, because if there is no finitely defined things, then the infinite is incomplete. The truly infinite, I'm not talking about an infinity of the same thing happening over and over again across linear time, and I'm not talking about the same object multiplied by infinity. I'm talking about everything that can possibly exist that we can possibly imagine, you know. And by everything I mean everything finite that is possible to exist, which complements the infinite, and it just carries on. And the infinite, in my view, which I'm increasingly favouring as I think deeply about this, is that the finite complements the infinite and vice versa. It turns out we can glimpse outside this conceptual box, as it were. We can exit conceptual reality through meditation. When we turn inwards, our minds open in that stillness. We realize that we were never just the clouds. The storms come and go, but we were always the sky. And the sky is clear and pristine. That is the nature of consciousness for me. That's the best analogy for it that I've come across so far. Waking up to that is true enlightenment, in my opinion. Enlightenment is waking up to the nature of consciousness, the nature of who you truly are, the unchanging reality the unborn. Thoughts, concepts, uh, percepts, they come and go. Our perception is in constant flux. It constantly changes. The world is constantly changing, as Heraclitus pointed out, but the awareness of it remains. It's constant. This is the only true, verified constant. It's clear and pristine. As Carl Jung once said, who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. We are the witness, the inexplicable subject, and it constitutes reality. Consciousness is everything. We may study and be in awe of the ceramics, but there is only clay. In this monistic analogy, everything else is an illusion. The objects are illusions. There was only ever mind and the shape it takes according to Shankara's non-dualism. Consciousness is the quiddity of reality, the quiddity before the moving liquidity. It's the canvas in which everything is expressed. It's the unchanging spirit that ever was, is, and always will be. Without it, there is no reality. Remove the clay, and you can forget about the pots and the plates. That subject is reality itself. And you can become aware of the subject in silence. You can watch thoughts come and go. You don't have to get rid of them. But in the silence, when everything is clear, you may become aware of it. And it's not something deep. It's right on the surface. It's who you are. It's the I am that I am. In my book, it's the only phenomenon, or Schopenhauerian noumenon, if you prefer, deserving of the God label, if one must insist upon this concept. When we deal with our human condition, we deal with stormy clouds and often forget that we are the sky. As humans, we all have darkness within us, but we can integrate it to make ourselves whole as human beings. In order to do this, we must seek to understand our nature. This is why meditation also helps, because it gets you to pay attention to what your own mind is doing, and then you can love yourself with understanding and learn to channel that inner beast appropriately in this world. We can regard aspects of ourselves compassionately. Some of my most amazing lucid dreams started out as non-lucid nightmares where I was being chased by monsters. Upon realizing I was dreaming, on one occasion I turned around to face a hideous monster with compassion and without fear, because you know what's really going on. And when I did so, I realized that the beast was me, and the beast began to shrink in size and turned into an adorable imp. And it was quite comical to see, but the compassion remained. And we smiled at each other like friends before embracing. Upon awakening, I can attest to the fact that I felt invigorated and like I had made peace with my own anxieties about waking life, which I had felt prior to falling asleep. And then I was thankful for my nightmare because it had led to something emotionally peaceful and beatific. I felt like I had accomplished something, because I was able to love unconditionally that ugly aspect of myself, turning it into a source of profound beauty. And I'm not claiming that I've tamed my beasts completely. I'm not claiming to be the best spiritual person ever, that I've sussed everything out about consciousness and controlling its tides. But I can tell you that this realization and this revelatory experience, and like many others in lucid dreams and other states of awareness, have shown me that I can be more aware of my own actions and my own thinking, my own mentation. And it may help me in the future in difficult situations where I find it hard to control my shadow, my Jungian shadow, where I find it hard to control the lions inside me, who surely are aggressive and angry and hungry for retribution at times. And I just have to manage my ego and all the facets of my personality. These states in meditation have shown me that I can have some control. I can become a good manager of myself, of this fictional self, which is useful in this world. They've shown me that it's not just chaos. It's not just me being pulled from pillar to post by some deterministic force. I can become aware of how things are going. I can become aware of my own thinking and my own emotions, and I can do something about them constructively, orderly. And this is the main reason why this realization that I have something to say about my own mentation is the main reason why I recommend meditation and recommend exploring consciousness itself and discovering other states. So to me, I think to me lucid dreaming is a great tool. As much as I can admire the approaches, or at least the rhetoric, of some spiritual teachers like Swami Sarvapriyananda or even Papaji, I ultimately explore my own mind and see what works for me. Mindfulness for me is just to pay attention to the contents in my field of awareness without judgment. And by the way, some people I felt like some people have wronged me in the past, and sometimes they try to reach out, but I'm only protecting myself by not allowing them back into my life, because I've got other things to focus, and it's also partly due to the fact that in the past other individuals have proved to me that they cannot be trusted. So I'm pretty sure that the latest altercation I've had with a couple of individuals, if I don't let them back into my life, it's only because of my past experiences, and I'm devoting my time to other things, and sometimes I just think it's best for people to go their separate ways, and for the time being, I think, even if there is no reconciliation in sight, for the time being, I think it's the best way, really. I've never claimed to be perfect. I'm only human. but I'm trying my best to progress, to evolve. Um, but yeah, it's time to let go and let bygones be bygones. But at the same time, I don't forget, and you know, it is what it is, really. Um, so mindfulness for me is just to pay attention to the content in my field of awareness, and without judgment. It's one of the things that certain meditators like Eckhart Tolle and who's the other guy? I can't remember his name now. Is helped soldiers to use mindfulness meditation to deal with stress. Um, I can't remember his name right now, but yeah, he emphasizes paying attention to the contents of your own consciousness without judgment, and that's key. Dreams, on the other hand, often appear to be psychological mirrors reflecting back to me aspects of myself. This is one of the reasons why I deem lucid dreaming to be a great tool to know oneself and aid self integration, because in the context of dream work, suddenly nightmares become potential opportunities to address the darker aspects of ourselves, which often scream for attention. In nightmares, upon realizing that I am dreaming, I stop running from the monsters. I turn around to face whatever representation of my Jungian shadow is chasing me, only to realize that, like a child, the monster wants to be understood and loved. Once I consider that psychical energy sans judgment and give it the opportunity to express itself, it often transmutes into something docile, friendly, and smaller, like a child, a folkloric being, or a cute animal, which I then embrace. It's usually the case with me when I manage to turn nightmares into something peaceful and loving. And the result upon awakening is always the same: fulfillment, happiness, and elation. Of course, one's own darkness or potential for it can be really frightening. Think of it this way: the night sky creates the contrast in which the stars can be seen to shine brightly, especially when there's no light pollution such as city lights. The view is romantic and often inspires awe. Some of the best poems and quotes about darkness and seeing the light, or pertinent to the yin and yang, use night sky analogies. Sometimes quotes about confronting darkness and how this one can influence human behavior in turn can sound more frightening, such as the following quote by Friedrich Nietzsche: "When you stare into the abyss stares back." It comes with a warning that if you try to comprehend evil, you might inadvertently unlock a darkness within you. George Orwell, who had spent 5 years in an imperial police um, uh, district, 5 years as a police officer in Burma, practically. So he was an imperial police officer. And Burma, which is now Myanmar, in the 1920s, also had a similar warning. George Orwell frightened himself because the imperial police of a fascist British India was unlocking a darkness within him. And he wrote about this. He found himself thinking like them, and such awakening to his own dark tendencies was enough to terminate that career and flee Burma. But oddly enough, it shows how certain dark and frightening situations can shine a light on aspects of your human nature that you might not be aware of. And here we psychologically tread in Jungian territory because it pertains to the shadow archetype and the idea of individuation. It turns out that darkness is also the most arduous to the light, and it certainly makes the latter eventually more prominent. The soul often endures a dark night before the rising dawn, heralded by Lucifer, the light bearer and the bringer of light. It's true that if you stare into the abyss stares back at you. But the longer you stare into the abyss, you begin to see the light. It's the hardest path to self-integration. In his book, Ion, researches into the phenomenology of the self, Carl Jung states, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Jung makes a point about correspondence with that statement. We are finite beings with reduced perspectives living in an infinite sea of finitely defined probabilities that reflect existential cycles like the Ouroboros, and fractality, which is captured by the religious phrase "as above, so below." In other words, the infinite wouldn't be perfect in its infinity if it didn't include finite expressions, as I said before, or transient forms, or an expression and sense of mortality against the concept of immortality. This is a perfect conception of God as much as a human mind can muster. So God, or the Godhead, exists, and it is infinite. I think there are grounds to refrain from deriding Jung for having stated that he didn't just believe in God, he knew God exists. Jung believed psyche was the foundation of all reality. So he was an idealist without saying he was one. It explores possibilities through different modes of perception, or perhaps the quality of itself is so clear and it fuels its luminous mind quality that when it tries to conceptualize it, it gets lost in translation, as it were, and ends up defining itself by what it's not, and in apophatic theism, resulting in illusory worlds where it believes itself to be finite selves, like the monkey mind of a novice meditator getting lost in conceptual thoughts and narratives. Irreducible consciousness as God takes the reductionist approach about itself, getting lost in concepts of self observer, and observed. I tend to say I'm an atheist in relation to certain concepts of God that don't resonate with me or appear to be contradictory. But I'm not an atheist in the strong or dogmatic sense. If people choose to see source consciousness as God or express a sort of panentheism or pantheism, I don't have a problem with it, other than to stipulate that ultimately the word God is a human concept that usually means something like more than what we are. Einstein used it poetically to refer to the universe, but he made it clear that he did not believe in a personal God. To me, and a metaphysical idealism, consciousness seems to be the only thing deserving of a label like that, because if it is the foundation and ultimate reality, then in a sense it is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, and potentially infinite, not to mention eternal, as the thing that was, is, and will always be. A human is finite and forgets things, but if a human being could have an infallible memory and could prolong his or her life to live indefinitely, then humankind is potentially omniscient in time. Chronological time. Consciousness here transcends both space and time, at least as defined in our universe. If it perceives both, and the knowing of both is required in consciousness for both to be. Of course, it can be difficult for our limited human minds to wrap around. Is consciousness God? It's up to us. It is the real us. It's the one and the many simultaneously. It is in us and all around us, and quite possibly the only thing that is real. Maybe the plurality of personal minds comes from a pristine awareness free of conceptual realities, a kind of pure consciousness that can't help but be aware of itself, attaining consciousness of consciousness, and starts to create many copies or projections of itself like a zygote during mitosis, because it only knows itself, so it propagates that through biosemiotic communication. But we mustn't get carried away with analogies, and these can only take you so far. But note how the tentative theory about a godly mind defining itself by what it's not still reflects linear thinking and reasoning, when what is actually the case may be totally ineffable to the human mind in terms of how it conceives space and time. We can't even imagine bounded space and time, let alone unbounded space and time. What truly transcends that would have to be beyond beginnings and endings, as my friend Stephen Woolard reminds me from time to time. There was never a beginning per se. There was never a beginning of everything. That's how the human mind perceives it. When you talk about consciousness being eternal, you're talking about something that is eternal but transcends linear time, and by virtue of that is truly eternal. It's beyond beginnings and endings, encompassing and being both the Alpha and the Omega as expressions of itself, viz. God. Creatures in the world experience love and safety in the familiar. Humans in general value family. On the other hand, sentient beings fear the unknown and the unfamiliar. It is true that, evolutionarily speaking, fear can aid self-preservation because it prompts us to do something about perceived danger. It's all true. It prompts us to seek safety and comfort. It also encourages some to heroically conquer fear and face the unknown for the sake of expanding horizons. The fear in limited, finite beings is born out of a sense of the unknown, a lack of information about an imperfect world that tends towards entropy and equally reflects a lack of information which defines it and matches that of human observation. Maybe love and fear are two sides of the same coin. And here, and maybe, the biblical notion of loving and fearing God is more cryptic than we initially imagined, especially when we have a tendency to interpret scripture in literalist terms. If we were to receive more information than is necessary to preserve our egoic minds, let's say we are flooded by data from the mind at large, then we wouldn't need a body. In fact, identifying with a finite organism would get in the way, and the avatar would eventually dissolve. This dissolution is the end of perceptual dissociation, and here we might as well be the unbounded mind of nature itself, the universal mind if you prefer. So although our dissociative barriers are somewhat porous, and sometimes it aids us to be ingenially inspired as we filter in a small percentage of divinity from that oceanic knowing, and here the Atman is in touch with the Brahman, it still behoves us to have a sensible perceptual cap so that our anthropic view isn't too compromised. There needs to be a balance. A human being, of course, is still potentially omniscient if allowed to live indefinitely and inordinately in time. But our godly nature is not and cannot be overtly expressed. It cannot be overtly expressed in one go on this level due to natural conditions and limitations. Recently, there was a parapsychological researcher who was interviewed on the Ascension Foundation channel. I can't remember his name, but he was talking about his study of children who appear to recall past lives and cases of ostensible reincarnation. And I was impressed with the distinction he had made between xenoglossy, which is being able to speak, write, or understand a foreign language that could not have been acquired by natural means, and glossolalia, which is speaking in tongues and not making much sense, almost sounding delirious. So two distinct phenomena. These phenomena certainly seem to reflect a difference between filtering extra knowledge from a reservoir of information beyond the normal scope of the experiencer as understood through physicalist terms, and a malfunctioning filter such as when the output of the brain, which reflects a delirious state, is impaired. The evidence certainly supports Kastrup's analytic idealism, where dissociative barriers and egoic minds are concerned. The convo was redolent of analytic idealism, and the research mentioned could potentially provide further evidence for refining idealistic models of reality. It also reminded me of Levin's Planaria, where there seems to be a rebirth of memories in newly grown heads. Humans, of course, can't grow heads like Planaria do, but we can start from scratch in new zygotes that eventually develop into children that can potentially recall past lives. And traumatic deaths seem to be linked to recall in childhood. I discussed this with Stephen Woolard of the Hermetic Idealism channel about these observations. When there is a traumatic death, and this death is recalled by an apparently new individual in a different time, separated by decades since the traumatic death of the individual who died, that seems to be linked to past life recall. We are not Planaria, but we have reports of people who remember being decapitated in a past life and seeing their decapitated bodies from above before continuing their experiential journeys that lead them to new chapters as someone else. I know to some people this may sound unbelievable, but you're hearing this from a former staunch materialist and an atheist. So, and I used to think that this was all nonsense. I dismissed it all because I adhered to the doctrine of materialism until I actually decided to look into this research for myself. I delved into it and it changed my mind. I can attest to the fact that everyone I've come across that has done research into reincarnation seems to become skeptical of their physicalism, and they start to entertain the possibility that reincarnation is real and can possibly be explained in scientific terms, but under the rubric of a different metaphysical view of reality, either panpsychism or idealism. And everyone I've come across that has done research into near-death experiences and deathbed visions, they either become convinced of an afterlife, or they seriously consider its possibility. So I would urge people to really look into this research, the research into people that remember being someone else, usually children. And there seems to be an element of free will from a transcendental realm where they can choose their lives and experiences. Sometimes there is a gap of years or decades between an alleged past life and rebirth into a new life. This gap is particularly interesting to me because children can report having gone to their true home, as they put it, before embarking on a new adventure. Or they say things like, I died and then I was in heaven before I chose my new mummy. I'm just glad the phenomena of apparent reincarnation, NDEs, OBEs, and even ESP are now being taken more seriously. They will help us to expand our horizons for sure. I have no doubt about this. Their study is an important line of inquiry, in my view. I've digressed again a little bit, so let me return to what I wanted to discuss today regarding seeing our deceased loved ones in lucid dreams, and then I might mention the case of a 9-year-old boy who had an NDE before I wrap up. It's a case I've mentioned before, which I found myself revising recently. But in an oniric context, the question is, when we lucid dream of deceased loved ones, is it really them in spirit form? This question can be tentatively answered from a physicalist perspective and with a double entendre. So I'll be playing devil's advocate here for a minute. One practically perceives the same mental model of them in a lucid dream that one perceived when they were alive. The same synaptic connections that transmogrify into a realistic impression of your loved ones can be posthumously reinforced with the practice of lucid dreaming. When they are alive and we perceive them, perception is constrained by sensory input, meaning that our mental models of them will mimic what they are doing in the objective world. When we perceive them posthumously in lucid dreams, the mental model is more fluid because it is unconstrained by sensory input and therefore liable to transformations driven by unconscious quicksands of mind, as it were. In this sense, it is correct to say that what is onirically perceived is not our loved ones. Those lucid dream doppelgangers are not the people we knew in life. They are loose emulations. I am of the opinion that it is better to have the truth served cold than believe a consoling lie. I would never claim with absolute certainty that what we perceive in lucid dreams are the spirits of the dead. But I would maintain that those oniric emulations of our deceased loved ones are still memory-based. Under physicalism, they would be the product of synaptically retrieving impressions from when the real thing was perceived, at least in terms of form, physical appearance, which of course is always subject to shape-shifting as time elapses. What the dream characters say, however, tends to come from the realm of imagination and the schematic associations which the subconscious tends to make. Of course, the premise of this way of thinking is a mechanistic assumption that relies on promissory physicalism, where mind is surmised to be an illusory epiphenomenon. Science revises and improves itself over time, but we, as human beings, are still prone to erroneous conclusions about empirical data. Sometimes scientists can derive the wrong conclusions with misinterpretations based on a priori assumptions. Um, Many neuroscientists, like Sam Harris, thought that Benjamin Libet's experiments proved hard determinism, that we don't have free will because brain activity is seen surging a third of a second before a person reports making a decision with the press of a button. Even though Libet himself thought that we have a free won't because we can apparently veto what was allegedly unconsciously decided by our brains. Turns out this experiment has been peer reviewed with other control measures in place, and different teams post Libet reckon the minimal action potential in the brain was misread. It didn't necessarily show decision making, but rather it seemed to correspond to a readying motor response to the experiment itself, and a similar potential was observed in monkeys before they were even presented with choices, showing that the animal's brain activity was just indicating their readiness potential. Moreover, the experiments involving humans that also included AI technology to better help the scientists identify neural correlations revealed corresponding activity occurring simultaneously or closer to reported decision making. All of this makes it more plausible that rather than disproving free will, the brain merely echoes decision making. It is also worth pointing out that some experiments testing global neuronal workspace theory showed that brain activity didn't always correlate with mental activity precisely, as in some cases a surge of brain activity would merely herald the start of a mental experience before quickly petering out and ceasing while the mentation persisted, and it could persist for a lot longer with no visible neuronic correspondence. As a man who was clued up on matters of psychology and was intrigued by concepts such as causality, coincidence, and meaning, Carl Jung said it well for a man of his time, and I quote, "Since psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another, and ultimately rest on unrepresentable transcendental factors, it is not only possible but fairly probable even that psyche and matter are two different aspects of the one and the same thing." Unquote. And Irving Schrödinger went as far as to say, and I quote again, "The total number of minds in the universe is one. In fact, consciousness is a singularity phasing within all beings." Unquote. This reflects a passage found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which reads, "I am one, seeing myself divided. I am 2 and 4 and 8. I am the universe in diversity. I am my transformations. This is my coming together. Here are my selves become one." It clearly describes a type of monistic idealism, as within, so without, as above, so below. As Douglas Harding would put it, "The whole world sits on my neck where a head should be, from where my body is all the way all the way to the horizon, as far as the eye can see. And it doesn't stop there. I look down and find that the rest of my body is also included in this expansive bubble or field of awareness. I seem to be the whole of reality, the whole universe pinned down to a limited perspective. Who am I? The subject, the witness, the absolute reality, the unborn, the eternal, the undeniable. So recently I reviewed the case of a kid in England who woke up from an induced coma to tell his parents and a befuddled doctor that he saw his grandparents in heaven. They had been deceased for years, by the way, and his father told him to shut up and that it was just a dream, clearly afraid that he could get psyched in the hospital. So he was worried for his son, but he was quite harsh at the same time. The boy insisted it was real and couldn't understand why he also encountered his older sister in heaven, because she was supposed to be living at university miles away. He reported that his sister said she was okay, that she loved them all, but that she was sorry she crashed. This is what the boy said when he woke up. The parents had stayed the night with him and were ready to take him home and didn't think much about what their son had been saying. When they got home, they found that there was a voicemail from the university asking them to call back with urgency. So they did, and they found, to their horror, that staff had tried to reach them all night because their daughter had been in a car crash with other students and passed away. Now, it seems like the 9-year-old boy had some kind of near-death experience where he was able to visit his deceased grandparents and his sister, that nobody at the time in the hospital knew had died. And, like this case, there are many reported NDEs which seem to provide evidence that nature allows for an afterlife, especially when they include elements that can be objectively corroborated, and it's yet to be scientifically understood. Such experiences certainly make more sense under metaphysical idealism than physicalism. And this particular NDE can be described as a Pekindarian phenomenon, where the experiencer sees a deceased individual whose death was unknown to them or others present at the time. And this strongly suggests that the deceased had his mind, not the deceased, this strongly suggests that the patient had his mind expanded. He was able to transcend spatial temporal barriers, and and it strongly suggests that the deathbed vision or near-death experience wasn't merely a product of expectation or hallucination. I mean, how could the boy expect his sister to be dead? It just doesn't make any sense. The term is called Pekindarian, and I've mentioned those experiences before in a past video, in one of my oldest videos actually. There seems to be much evidence supporting the notion that the dead often rely on the living to have NDEs in order to establish a strong communication. And if we entertain a hypothesis based on what was reported by the parapsychologist whom I mentioned previously, the boy's dead sister may remember the life she just completed in her next incarnation, as traumatic or violent deaths appear to be linked to what he called the glitch of past life recall. So this parapsychologist on the Essential Foundation, I still can't remember his name. He reckons these glitches, as he called them, are the result of a traumatic death prior to rebirth, prior to reincarnation, and the trauma causes the soul in the new body to recall everything, whereas normally it would all be forgotten, like the rest of us, most of us, I presume. Um, a traumatic death appears to create an anomaly where subjects remember past lives in their new lives, and they are usually children, and then as they grow older, they tend to forget, unless of course the parents remind them, or the researchers remind them, or they never live down the fact that some of these stories are, or their extraordinary acclaim or experience is published for others to see. But yeah, it's like we are supposed to forget, so that we are fully focused on our current lives. Forgetting other lives helps us to focus at present. Of course, it seems to be possible to recall various lives during an NDE, which again involves trauma, but this time to the new body. I could be onto something here, but I can't be sure other than to point out certain patterns emerging from these reports, and they may be our first steps towards a better metaphysical understanding of reality, and we will be able to do this by also heeding scientists and philosophers who are serious about this and oppose dogmatism. Look, I've gone on for quite a while now, but let me leave you here with three quotes: two by Max Planck, the Nobel Prize winner and originator of quantum theory, and two by Paramahansa Yogananda, a Hindu monk and yogi. So Max Planck said, and I quote, "As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you as a result of my research about the atoms this much. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particles of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Unquote. And here's his second one, which I also love, and I quote, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Unquote. And now, Yogananda, quote, you are walking on the earth as in a dream. Our world is a dream within a dream. You must realize that to find God is the only goal, the only purpose for which you are here. For Him alone you exist. Him you must find. Unquote. It was taken from a book called The Divine Romance, and here's his second and final quote. The Lord is not a person with sense organs, but consciousness itself. God is consciousness. There is essentially nothing in the universe but mind or consciousness. Unquote. And by the way, if you're wondering about the picture that you see now of two veiled women seemingly praying and with very large eyes, redolent of the court characters in a deck of cards, that's something I saw zoom past me in the hypnagogic state once, and I found it quite strange and decided to try to depict that experience as much as I could. They were very luminous and seemed very spiritual in a way. And yes, they gave me the heebie-jeebies. So I wouldn't like to encounter them again. I'd like to think that if I do at some point in the future, that I'll be more prepared, and especially if I'm thinking about trying the Psychomanteum. But you know what? Here's two more quotes just for the heck of it, because I just love these quotes. One's by Jerry Fodor, the Jerry Fodor, right? I think that's how you pronounce his name. A philosopher of our times. He said, and I quote, "Nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Nobody even knows what it would be like to have the slightest idea about how anything material could be conscious." So it should fly in the face of physicalists. And here's another one by Galen Strawson. Either what we know the most is matter and consciousness is a mystery, or consciousness is what we know most intimately and matter is what's mysterious. Unquote. And to finalize, one of my favorite quotes of all time is by my former teacher, college lecturer, John Thurman, whom I'm still friends with on Facebook. And I quote, "Time does not exist as we know it, as it would need a beginning, which makes no sense. Space does not exist as it would need a boundary, which makes no sense. Material does not exist as we perceive it, as it cannot come from nothing, as it cannot come from nowhere, sorry. It is a hard problem, but our consciousness is everything. That's how we put it. I would go as far as to say that there is no hard problem. It's been made up by promissory physicalists. So, but it's still one of my favourite quotes of all time, because it shows that reality isn't what most people think it is. Reality isn't some machine. Reality is made up of discrete packets of waves and superpositions, made up of many wave-like patterns. So right there is no absolute reductionism. Reality is fuzzy at the subatomic level. It begins to look more like a dream. So that's that, really. Thank you very much for listening, and if you resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. We are one mind. Thank you. Until next time.